Is the officer at a safe distance? He decides not to shoot, but would he have been justified in shooting? Or would you have waited and continued talking? 7 officers chased the suspect on foot. Here they circled the suspect again. He broke free and ran 2 more blocks, then crashed through the front window of a house. When he started attacking a resident inside, officers fired 6 shots, which finally stopped him. When you're threatened with an edged weapon, your appropriate force response ideally begins with your sidearm ready. Edged weapons are instruments of deadly force, and whenever possible, you must be prepared to use your ultimate force option if necessary. Whether you actually have to use deadly force will depend on the suspect's action. Think in terms of a 3-part formula. Intent. Do the suspect's words and actions convince you that he means to kill or cause serious or lethal bodily harm to you or someone else? Does the threat here seem imminent? Yes, it does. Another element that must be present is a weapon. Some instrument with which he is capable of carrying out his deadly intent. That's present here, too. A third element is a delivery system. Does he have the means of getting the impact of that edged weapon from him to you to fulfill his intent? Here, the suspect is certainly activating his delivery system. When intent, weapon, and delivery system are present, and the threat is imminent, you are justified in using deadly force.
Would you like us to play the second clip?
Why don't we handle it 1 clip at a time? You said you had 3?
Yes.
Your Honor, our objection is it's not probative, first of all, or relevant because it's not substantially similar to the issues in our case. We have a video of what actually happened in our case, and it's nothing like this with this man with this giant pick-like thing running at officers. And it's intended to inflame the jury. It's intended to scare them about a knife that's not like the one we have here, and with an assailant who's running at people. So it's not substantially similar, so therefore it's not probative, it's unfairly prejudicial, and we think that clip should be excluded. And it goes to the ultimate issue of, under these circumstances, when you have a knife, you're justified in using force. And also it goes to, or else you're gonna go into the community and break into someone's house, which also wasn't at all an issue here, where Mr. Boyd was actually put, as soon as he had the knives out, gets tasered, he puts the knives to his side, turns to his left and go down. There was no running, he wasn't going toward any neighbor, he wasn't doing anything, he was turning to get down on the ground, so therefore it's misleading.
What does it offer to show?
Officer Perez received this training when he was in the Albuquerque Police Department Academy. So you will have a witness, David Hubbard, who taught that class, explain this is what I taught Officer Perez's cadet class, including Officer Perez, about edged weapons. So what we have here is very similar to what you have in the APD use of force SOP. There you have, that's intent, means, and opportunity. And then you have a similar way of presenting that same information displayed in this particular video. Now, the whole thing about it being relevant, well, Mantelli tells us that you look at an officer's training to make assessments as to whether their actions in a particular incident are reasonable. And having been trained that you make assessments, again, I think they talk about intent, immediacy, weapon, and delivery system. That's very similar to the SOP. Again, this is a national, this is a production that wasn't for the Albuquerque Police Department. This is a production that was disseminated nationwide, but it was incorporated into training that the Albuquerque Police Department provided Officer Perez, and that's why it's relevant. Mantelli makes it relevant to this case because in order to understand whether the officer acted in accordance with his training, you have to look at the training. And what you will find with the training is that the training is consistent with the SOP, and we will submit to you, of course, Your Honor, that Officer Perez's actions were consistent with the APD SOP. Again, going back to your rulings about why the APD SOP was admissible, and that is that if it's incorporated into training, then that's what made it relevant. Here we have an example of that. going back to this court's own ruling, that this training emphasizes what's in the SOP. And again, I think the similarities speak for themselves. Now, with regard to this notion that it's unduly prejudicial, again, I don't know how in 2000, I think it was in 2008 or 2006, that an instructor could foretell that there would be this incident involving James Boyd, and I need to train the officers to deal with the facts of the James Boyd incident. This is how he was trained, as opposed to training for an event that no one could foresee. And that's the problem I have with the objection, as that it's not substantially similar. Again, you know, the similarities here are actually rather striking. But how can you expect someone someone years ago to predict that there would be the incident involving James Boyd and develop training to deal with that specific incident? That's where that argument falls apart. Training is meant to deal with these scenarios that officers come in contact with a certain amount of regularity, and that's what we have here. It can't be precise to an incident in the future, because how could you foretell the future in that way? So that's our position on the state's objection.
Your Honor, I think training obviously is a huge part of what the jury needs to consider when it comes to police officers and these police officers. Apparently, my understanding is that Officer Perez was trained with this video about dealing with edged weapons. So I think it's absolutely relevant, and I don't think it's prejudicial.
Like this particular clip, which I believe you said was minute 55 and 48. It's 55:08, is that right?
Yes, 55:08 to 57:22.
Okay. It's highly relevant. It goes to the training on the topic that's relevant to the officer's perception of threat of death or great bodily harm. It's not gory or highly inflammatory, so I'm overruling the objection.
Your Honor, as long as the clip is coming in, there's no evidence and will be no evidence that Defendant Sandy was trained with this video, and we'd ask for a limiting instruction to the jury that the jury considers this video only as relevant to the training that Mr. Perez received and not as relevant to any training that Defendant Sandy received, because there's been no evidence whatsoever that he received and watched this video.
How can they possibly say that, Your Honor? They haven't even heard my client testify. I don't think the limiting instruction is appropriate, Your Honor.
We've asked for all evidence of training records, and you know that Defendant Perez watched this video. We have nothing that suggests that Defendant Sandy watched this video, and unless and until they can establish that, we don't think it's fair that it be used to suggest that Defendant Sandy in any way received this training.
I'll entertain the request at the close of the evidence. Next.
Again, from Officer Perez's Exhibit J, it is a portion of the video beginning at 40 minutes, 34 seconds to 43 minutes and 10 seconds.
The crucial tactic for you buying time to assess a suspect and to protect yourself against an edged weapon you don't immediately see is this: control distance. Many officers, like the one on the left, really believe if they're close to the action, they're in control. But this attitude disregards the proxemics of the situation. That's the relationship between distance and the threat level produced by the weapon present. A common problem whether there's one officer involved or the whole shift. What about officers responding on the street below this offender? Are they too close to his gun threat? They're ignoring the concept of the reactionary gap, the distance you need from a potential threat to defend yourself if an attack is launched. For firearms assaults, a reactionary gap can be a half mile or more if good cover isn't available. To defend yourself against assaults from hands and feet, you need a reactionary gap of about 10 feet. Most officers think that's good enough for edged weapons too. But this unrehearsed training exercise shows just how fast a knife offender can shrink your reactionary gap. Here, officers have been told to investigate suspicious circumstances at night in a warehouse and react to what they find. At first glance, this officer's distance from the suspect looks safe enough. But an attacker can easily cover this distance faster than most officers can draw their guns. Remember, when you close the distance between yourself and the suspect, do so only by purposeful decision. In fact, at close distances, your only realistic option for controlling a suspect is empty hand tactics. Yet when officers are asked how they would control a knife attacker, they usually say, "I should," forgetting that they may not have time to in reality. Here, still unrehearsed, is what really happens when officers assume they can automatically use deadly force against a knifer. They stand their ground and try to draw. Or try to draw and disengage simultaneously. Or even worse, try to draw, fall down, and shoot. And they lose. Because time and distance work for the offender and against the officer.
Your Honor, this video in particular has, first of all, none of it is substantially similar to our case. There's no element that they didn't know he had a knife. There's no element that they didn't know what they were dealing with. It's a surprise situation. The officer goes in and doesn't know what they're dealing with. They don't have their guns drawn. And the whole point is you have to create distance in order to create guns, and if you're surprised, you don't have time to react that way. But here, they had their guns drawn. They had multiple guns drawn. They had lethal cover all around. They had all of those options, so it's not at all similar. And it's confusing, and Your Honor, there's a lot of racial issues in this video that I think are unfairly prejudicial and inflammatory. You have a black man with a gun up high and a white officer down below. I think it's inappropriate. I think it's unfairly prejudicial, and it's intended to inflame and anger people, and I think it should not be used in this case.
Yes, to take the last argument first, when you watch that video, you sort of realize it's sort of like, there is the African American on the rooftop, but there's also the African American officer. There are Hispanics and there's white officers, and the Asians. I'm not really sure why identifying a particular person in the video. Again, there were white, I guess Caucasian males as offenders. So it seemed that it was really balanced in sort of showing everyone everywhere and every position of authority and as a suspect. So that seems like a rather strange argument to begin with. Now, that being said, this is how Officer Perez was trained, and you might recall Sergeant Fox's testimony about the reactionary gap. It is the training, again, he said, that all Albuquerque Police Department officers receive. And part of that training comes from this video. And again, to try and explain what it is, and at its most core level, that's what this particular clip does. That you think you can react in a particular way quick enough to deal with the action of the suspect. And here's a graphic example about this whole notion that you cannot react fast enough if you have not created distance. So the argument the state has that our situation was different sort of misses the point about what this video is all about. And that is, here's what happens if you're too close. Create distance and you will increase your reactionary gap. So that's how it begins in terms of everyone comes in with this mindset that if you're, again, this is the video, if you're close to the action, you're in control. But that disregards the proxemics of the event. And then it explains, I think, in a very natural and powerful way what happens if you're too close, which is, of course, an issue in this case. And that's why it's relevant. The fact that, that they could not foretell that there would be an incident with James Boyd is, again, beside the point. This is the training that Officer Perez received.
Can you play the first few seconds with the dummy that's being stabbed?
The crucial tactic for you buying time to assess a suspect and to protect yourself against an edged weapon you don't immediately see is this: control distance.
You want to keep going, Your Honor?
This is the piece that I think is somewhat problematic, and I don't think that you lose any of your point about the training and the distance and the importance of the distance with what you have in the remainder of the video.
We will, so long as we have the lunch hour, we can make that change.
Okay. So I'm going to overrule the objection, except for that first piece where the gun was being violently stabbed. Next.
The third clip is from Officer Perez Exhibit J, and it begins at the 43-minute, 38-second mark to the 45-minute, 45-second mark.
At about 10 feet, you might get your sidearm out, but you probably won't get a shot off. A suspect with a knife can close 7 paces and deliver deadly force in less than 1 1/2 seconds. For the average officer to deliver 2 rounds against an attacker who starts moving at 10 feet, the sidearm must already be drawn and ready to shoot. At about 15 feet, your chances get a little better if you're alert, anticipate danger, and are skilled with your equipment. But to deliver 2 rounds center of mass, your hand would already have to be on your sidearm when the attack begins. Tests with hundreds of officers reveal that in most cases, a minimum reactionary gap of 21 feet is required to react and deliver at least 2 rounds and to have enough time to move out of the attacker's path. And in certain other situations, you'll need more distance.
So that is the clip, Your Honor.
That's a slightly different clip than we got last night. I just want to make sure that that's all that we intend to show.
That's all.
Yeah. So our objection, Your Honor, is to the very first part and again, misleading in that only the clips where the officers already have their guns drawn should be used. Where they don't have their guns drawn in their bare hands, that's not what we had in this case. And the fact that there were guns out, we think that's relevant and they can use those. But the other ones are not substantially similar and therefore not appropriate.
This is the training that Officer Perez
I was
received.
going to say, I'm not persuaded by that argument because this is the actual training, if I understand it correctly. So the points that you make may be right for cross-examination or argument to the jury, but doesn't mean it's irrelevant or unduly prejudicial.
And one more, Your Honor, and that is the clip of the person getting stabbed to death under 403. It's intended to frighten people about knives and scare them about what is not what we didn't have in this case. And so under 403, we'd also object.
Again, these are recreations. I mean, no one's actually getting stabbed. I think anyone who watches it realizes it's just an exercise. And it's meant to show what can happen as opposed to this is what happens when someone gets stabbed. I think that that's sort of, yesterday this was characterized as a slasher video. And again, I can understand why Ms. McGinn said that, but by the same token, how can you tell somebody, here are the consequences if you're too close, if you don't graphically show this 21-year-old cadet, this is what happens if you close the distance and you put yourself in danger. And that's the point we're trying to make. And Officer Weimersford did not have any weapons in his hand when he closed the distance and was 9 feet in front of Mr. Boyd. So it is highly relevant.
I don't disagree that it's highly relevant. I understand the term that was used yesterday, the slasher video, based on what I saw, some of the pieces from the beginning of the video, and even some towards the end of the video, but you're not including any of the clips that I think would be characterized as gory and slasher type. So you can play 4338 to 4545 because it's highly relevant with regard to the training and not unduly prejudicial. Everyone ready for the jury?
Did you get a chance to review the limiting instruction or the instruction that the defendants are proposing?
I'm not sure if I have everything. I was handed before walking into the courtroom an email from today at 7:04, and then I did receive the state's trial brief regarding defendant Perez's proposed limiting instruction. I don't know if there's others.
I think that's it, Your Honor. I don't know that you've had, obviously you haven't had an opportunity to review that yet, but perhaps we could address that this afternoon.
Perhaps after lunch, so I can have time to look.
Sure. Thank you, Your Honor.
Who's the next witness for defense?
Ronald McCarthy.
You want to have him walk in?
Watch your step.
We're going to bring in the jury, so we'll all stand to show respect for their service. When I tell everyone they may be seated, you and I will remain standing so I can administer.
Yes, sure.
Please stand. Thank you. May be seated. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please raise your hand. You swear or affirm to tell the truth and nothing but the truth under penalty of law?
I do, Your Honor.
Thank you. May be seated. Lastly, you state your name for the record and spell your last name.
My name is Ronald M. McCarthy, M-C-C-A-R-T-H-Y.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. McCarthy.
Good morning, sir.
Is it correct to say that you are here to provide expert witness testimony on the topics of police procedures, including the use of force?
Yes, sir.
Now, before we ask you about your opinions in this case, I'd like to establish your background and credentials regarding your expertise. You worked for the Los Angeles Police Department, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And when did you start working for the Los Angeles Police Department?
June 1960.
And how many years did you serve as a Los Angeles Police Department officer?
A little over 24 years.
Now, I understand that you worked as a patrol officer, is that correct?
Yes.
And what experience did you have as a patrol officer in Los Angeles working in that area known as Skid Row?
Skid Row, I worked as a B-wagon officer, which is the drunk wagon, is what we called it, and foot beats. And Skid Row was that section of the community, and still is. It hasn't changed geographically, although there's far more people there now than there was then who suffered from a variety of different issues, dementia, paranoid schizophrenics, people who were impacted severely with drug issues and drug problems, and sometimes a combination of all of that. And Skid Row probably has, within about 4 or 5 square blocks, about 5,000 people living on the sidewalk.
And how many years did you work in this area of Los Angeles known as Skid Row?
For 2 years.
Now, there's a term that's often used by police officers called emotionally disturbed, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Why is that term emotionally disturbed used by police officers as opposed to mentally ill?
The term is, or they use the abbreviation EDP for emotionally disturbed person, is utilized because police officers really aren't psychiatrists, they're psychologists, and it covers the broad spectrum of different mental illnesses. And officers are trained through their training and their experience to recognize people who have these disabilities, these mental and emotional disabilities. And they're trained to try to, based on their own personalities and their own ability to communicate, because everybody is different in terms of their ability to do so, to communicate, interact with people who have troubles like that.
Now, there came a point in time in which you became a special weapons and tactics officer, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
When was that?
That was my last 13 years on the department, 1970, end of 71, beginning of 72, until I retired in 84.
Now, did you work as a SWAT team officer for the Los Angeles Police Department?
SWAT team supervisor. I was a squad leader and eventually the assistant commander of the SWAT team. And I was assigned one of the 6 squads. There were 6 sergeants. When the lieutenant was absent or the lieutenant was on vacation or they were selecting a new one, I would be the commander of the SWAT team until they made their selection or the lieutenant returned.
In those 13 years that you worked as a SWAT team supervisor, how many call-outs or SWAT activations had you been on?
We averaged about 160 to 200 call-outs a year, generally in that area. So over the course of 12 plus years, about that many. So it was in the 1,000 area.
Now, how much experience did you have as a SWAT team supervisor addressing situations in which an individual was emotionally disturbed and armed?
It happened quite often. It was probably about 25 to 35% of our call-outs would be people who were acting out in a very bizarre way, irrational, sometimes emotionally disturbed people, sometimes drugs, sometimes a combination of the both were involved.
In what ways has SWAT work changed from when you were there in the 1970s to today?
It hasn't changed that much. Technology, robots, better forms of communication rather than having to carry a portable radio. The communication factor has improved tremendously. There was night vision. It was rather archaic then. The night vision tools now are better. But essentially, it still boils down to finding the very best people you can find, because ultimately the technology gets you to the place where you have to interact personally. And that doesn't go away. We don't have a robot or any kind of scientific tool that can handcuff a violent suspect.
Now, in those 13 years that you were a SWAT team supervisor, could you just generally but briefly describe the type of training you received that helped you do your job?
The training was the mechanics of the job, the equipment, the protective gear, that ballistic protection for the body, for the head. That's something that you have to learn how to wear and how to work for hours. I have had a call out that went 33 hours and you're wearing 48 to 50 pounds of equipment for 33 hours. It's kind of tiring. And so that's part of it. And then negotiations is a huge part of special weapons and tactics.
So let me ask you, during your work as a SWAT team supervisor, what training did you receive on crisis negotiations?
I probably attended, I would imagine, or approximately 20 negotiations training programs, and they usually lasted 3 to 5 days. But I went to as many as I could, and I could go to a lot because my department provided a lot. And then also we worked very closely with the LA County Sheriffs, and they are a very good law enforcement agency with a very good tactical team, and I went to all of their training because I could do it, and so I made sure I did.
Why is crisis negotiations an important part of SWAT work while you were at the Los Angeles Police Department?
It's important because there is a variety of different circumstances that can take place. And you have to be able to identify the different kinds of people, the different kinds of background for why these people or this person is doing what they're doing. And you have to sometimes do that without ever seeing the person. A suspect holding a woman in a hotel room for, in this case, 33 hours. I mentioned the time frame. And we never saw him or her until he presented himself with her with a gun to her chest, covered by part of her chest. We couldn't even see the muzzle of the gun, and he presented himself, didn't announce that he was going to do that, and then you have to be able to respond to that. There's others where you can negotiate and talk to somebody like that, and eventually they cooperate, and you take them into custody without any violence whatsoever.
Okay.
But there's priorities. The first priority is not
So
the
let me ask that
suspect.
question so that you know. Would you please explain the priorities that exist when negotiating with an individual that the SWAT team would encounter?
Yes. The priorities are very clear. Our first priority is the hostage or hostages, if there is a hostage circumstance. Our second priority is citizen safety. Our third priority is police officer safety. And we will never violate the suspect's constitutional rights. We would prefer to take him into custody verbally without injury to him or her, but usually it's a him. And at that, saying that, we may have to use force to do it. So we
how
want to
is-
do it without force if we can.
So how is that calculation made that if you seek to achieve a peaceful resolution with verbal negotiations, when the decision, when the tide turns so that a use of force becomes the best or the way to resolve a standoff with someone?
That's a educated guess. If I could say this, there's a point in time when somebody, the incident and tactical commander, has to make the determination as to when conversation, negotiations is no longer being productive. We're not gaining any ground. And that's a decision that hopefully your training and your experience in handling a variety of different people hundreds and hundreds of times, hopefully we get better at it. And we have to make a decision based on a number of things. But the first one would be citizen safety.
Okay.
That's our first concern.
Now, what hard and fast rules exist, if any, with regard to when you move from verbal negotiations to a force option?
The rule is that you first, if possible, apply verbal strategies and verbal techniques. And if you have the opportunity to do that, you do it. And then the circumstances of the incident, time, geography, the medical condition of different people, the fatigue factor for the police officers who are at the scene. There's so many things that go into when we make a decision to decide to take a step in order to resolve it. And the step can be a variety of different circumstances based on the situation that we're in geographically.
Now, what is the progression that a reasonable officer would take when going down the course of using force to resolve a standoff with a suspect?
The general progression would be, first of all, officer presence and demeanor of the officer. He or she has to present themselves and present themselves in such a way as they look and act professional. Second is what's being said and how that officer utilizes verbal strategies. And we take that step. The next step would be a hands-on, soft hands-on control, if possible, and the subject wasn't armed with a gun or a knife. Soft hand control. And if the subject pulled away from soft hand control, then we escalate to hard hand control, which means now we're going to utilize force, some pain, but not necessarily injurious, but it could happen depending upon whether the resistance escalates. And then after that, we wind up utilizing tools which do injure. And that could be hands and feet, or it could be a police baton, or it could be a taser, or it could be a chemical agent, OC spray that officers have on their duty belt. OC spray is usually a nice choice if you can do it, and it's appropriate, generally inside, because you don't have any wind. So
What's the problem with using OC spray in an outdoor setting?
it's very unpredictable in and out. I've sprayed myself numerous times doing training with police officers, and we're outside, and my intention is to give a 1-second spray to the trainee that I'm providing the training for, and I wind up where I thought the wind was on my side and I was wrong. So it does come back and bite you, and maybe there's justice in that when you're spraying a whole lot of people and making them uncomfortable.
Now, there came a time, I believe in 1984, when you retired from the Los Angeles Police Department, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I believe you went to work at the Department of Energy's Central Training Academy, is that right?
Yes.
Where is the Department of Energy's Central Training Academy located?
On Kirtland Air Force Base here in Albuquerque.
How many years did you live and work in our city?
Almost exactly 2 years.
Now, what is the Department of Energy Central Training Academy?
That's the government entity that is supposed to be involved with nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. And nuclear materials are developed in 5 or 6 different locations around the country, and then Pantex, Texas, is where nuclear weapons are built. And my job was to train personnel to guard the military nuclear assets, both the facilities and the materials that are transported, so that they don't fall into the hands of a terrorist entity or a foreign organization.
Is it fair to say that the type of training you provided was essentially for domestic law enforcement purposes?
Yes, it was.
Now, in your work at the Central Training Academy, what interaction did you have with the Albuquerque Police Department?
Once I was doing the training, I was made aware that Albuquerque PD needed training that they couldn't afford at the time, because training does cost money and taxpayer dollars. And so there was an opportunity for us to help out, because if we had a class of 20 people that were training from different nuclear sites or military bases where nuclear assets were stored and confined, if we could throw 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 Albuquerque police officers in the mix, they could get the training too, because our training wasn't military. Our training was local law enforcement, domestic law enforcement, because that's what DOE is. It's not the military.
Now, where exactly is the Central Training Academy located in relationship to the Manzano Mountains?
It's very close to the Manzano Mountains, right at the foot of the Manzano Mountains.
Now, I understood you also lived in the foothills of the Sandias during the time you lived in this city.
Yes, sir.
And how familiar are you with the location where where the incident happened with Mr. Boyd?
Reasonably familiar, sir. I have been there and walked up the area and collected a whole bunch of cactus needles in my feet. So I found that out, and I did go there and look at it.
Okay. Now, there came a point in time when you became the project coordinator for the Deadly Force Training Program that was, I guess, managed by the International Associations of Police and the United States Department of Justice. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What did you do as a project coordinator for the Deadly Force Training Program?
My job was to train police chiefs first, then middle managers, and eventually all ranks as the training program evolved for the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Department of Justice in deadly force and use of force, not just the physical aspects of it, but also how to write the policies and procedures and guidelines, and how to write and develop and put on reasonable training.
Now, I didn't ask, and I apologize for not asking you this earlier. What is the International Association of Chiefs of Police?
That's an organization that was founded over 100 years ago, based in the Washington, D.C. area. It's always been back there. And it was founded to provide assistance to police chiefs across the United States, because there's over 17,000 police departments, and a lot of them are underfunded and don't have a lot of assets. And so the organization was to give police chiefs an opportunity to get training and see what's going on in the rest of the country. And then it became international. Canada, obviously, all the police departments in Canada with 50 or more officers are involved in IACP, and then there are police departments from other parts of the world that are involved in it.
Now, there was also the United States Department of Justice. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And what role did they play in essentially managing or supervising the deadly force training that you gave?
Well, they funded it, and there was a member from the Department of Justice that was monitoring what we were doing all the time from the Department of Justice to make sure that what we were doing was consistent with what they perceived as what was constitutional and what fit within the parameters of the kind of democracy, the republic in which we live here in the United States.
Now, to sum up the firearms training that you have given other officers, it's correct to say that as a sergeant with the Los Angeles Police Department, you provided firearms instruction to SWAT team members for the Los Angeles Police Department?
Yes, sir.
And in your role as I guess it was the Chief of Tactical Operations at the Central Training Academy, would it be fair to say you also provided firearms training?
Yes, sir.
How extensive was that firearms training?
Very extensive. We had an opportunity to do it right, so there was the basic training to familiarize law enforcement personnel inside and outside DOE with their defensive weapon, a pistol, which is a defensive weapon, and with rifles and shotguns. And that training was basic all the way up to we constructed a shooting house and live fire training at night in the dark with multiple officers making entries and shooting three-dimensional targets with bullet traps that could be moved to different parts of the rooms, and all the rooms were ballistic, so it was very realistic training and opportunity for officers to get to a level of training that would predictably increase their success in the field.
Now, we had talked about your work as a project coordinator for the Deadly Force Training Program, and I understand that you were there from 1986 to 1992, is that right?
Yes.
And in and then at that same time, or about that same time, you were also the manager for the Center of Advanced Police Studies, is that right?
Yes, sir.
What does that mean?
That was the International Association of Chiefs of Police, long before I got there, did police training, training of police chiefs, and then after I got there, the training expanded all the way down to officers and deputies in the field. So they've always been a training asset for law enforcement. And I ran the training program at the same time that I was doing the federal grant.
Now, what manuals or training materials did you personally prepare when you were doing your work at the Center for Advanced Police Studies and also with the Deadly Force Training Program?
Deadly force training, field tactics for police officers, how to supervise at critical incidents, first line supervision sergeants, second line lieutenant, that can be an Achilles heel, a weak spot for law enforcement, and then middle management, and then training police chiefs to put in place the appropriate guidelines and standards for their department that's consistent with the Constitution and state law does vary in different states, and to do all of that the right way.
Now, in your best estimate, how many people have been trained with the materials you have personally prepared regarding the use of force, including the use of deadly force?
I would estimate it's probably well over 25 or 30,000 people over the years now.
Now, you also served as adjunct faculty at the Fulton College for Police Training, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And how many years have you done that work?
I believe about 18.
Okay. And what type of work did you do as adjunct faculty at the Fulton College of Police Training?
The training young people who are considering law enforcement as a career, and training them. I taught 2 classes. One was about equipment and how to utilize it, how to wear it, and then the other one was a class on police fear. And that there's a thing that is utilized now in police guidelines and standards for different departments, and it's called reasonable fear or unreasonable fear. And that was something that I had taught in a class.
Now, what type of training do you currently do for law enforcement throughout the country?
I do critical incident command training, first line supervision, control of major violent incidents, a variety of different classes, small agency response to major violent incidents where a department may have only 2 or 3 officers, the police chief and 1 or 2 other people, because they have the same thing happen the big cities do, and they don't have the resources, and other agencies are far away. So that's part of what I do now, special weapons and tactics training. I think that covers it.
And which,
I'm sorry, and I do ambush and counter-ambush training, because that has come back. It was very popular on the part of bad people in the 1960s, and now it's resurfaced.
Now, which police departments are you providing training to currently?
I am going to be next week going to Arkansas to train the Arkansas Tactical Officers Association personnel. So I'll train a few hundred people there. And I have a calendar with other classes that I'll be doing in other places. I go about once a month to twice a month to different places and do training on different topics.
Did you teach at the Dallas Police Department?
I have, yes.
And you certainly taught in New Mexico, is that correct?
Yes, sir. I taught there, taught in New York. I was on New York Police Department's Firearms Review Committee for 2 years.
Now, I didn't ask you about that. So is that the NYPD, the New York Police Department?
Yes, sir.
And what did you do in their Firearms Review Committee?
I was one of 5 members, and I was the practical guy. I'm not an academic, but I do have some police experience. So I was the practical person to talk to the subject of whether the New York Police Department officers' use of force was appropriate or not. And we evaluated all their shootings and use of force situations that involved injury to anybody.
Now, you've authored, from what I was able to gather, at least 20 manuals and books and chapters in books. Does that sound about right?
Yes, sir. Probably that would be about right.
I'd just like to ask you about just a small number of them. I understand that in 1989 you drafted a manual called Reasonable and Unreasonable Fear in Police Encounters. It was published by the International Chiefs of Police. Is that right?
Yes.
What was that manual about?
That was the discussion of reasonable and unreasonable fear. What generated reasonable fear, what generated unreasonable fear. Not everybody is cut out to face chaos and violent confrontation, and not everybody is emotionally wired to do that. Some people cannot be trained to do that well, no matter what kind of training they go through. A good part of that is 10% of all police officers cannot use deadly force even to save their own life. It's not something they can do. They cannot shoot. They can fight with people, they can wrestle with people, they can tase them, pepper spray them, but they cannot shoot somebody. And that means that it can cost their life, but also can cost another officer's life or a citizen's life because they're not capable of doing it.
Now, did this manual provide the reader with, guidelines for assessing whether an officer is making their fears reasonable or unreasonable?
Yes, it's a discussion of, first of all, the causes of unreasonable fear. What creates unreasonable fear? And a quick example would be if you took a 10-year-old kid and put him in a semi-truck and said, drive this, I think they'd be intimidated. You might find one that'd be pretty excited, but most would be intimidated. And so when we place people without the proper training and equipment, and you have to have both, in a violent environment, in a confrontational environment, not everybody can handle it, even if they've been given the right equipment and the right training. And we tried to find who has this unreasonable fear. They're not able to, even with the best training and equipment, they're not able to do the right thing under stress and pressure. And the confrontation dominates them, and they use force when they shouldn't.
Okay. Now, I believe you also wrote another manual published by the United States Department of Justice in 1990, and it's entitled Fear, It Kills, a monograph and training guide on police-related fear. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What does that manual that was produced by the United States Department of Justice tell the reader?
It tells the reader how how to identify people who provide indicators in academy environments, exhibit characteristics that are consistent with not being able to handle confrontation and chaos, and then how to teach and how to direct those individuals who can. And hopefully we eliminate the ones who exhibit those characteristics that tell us that they're not going to do well in confrontation, because you are going to have confrontation in law enforcement.
I know you said you're not an academic, but you're a practical guy. But it's true that you've written books that where you have been a co-author with college professors. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I believe one of those of a number of books is The Management of Police Specialized Tactical Units. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And that was written with a college professor. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And who is that?
Dr. Tom Majerus from Texas State University in Texas, and he was a former Detroit police officer before moving on in his later years and getting a PhD. So I kind of borrow from his PhD.
Now, what does this
Makes me look good.
Okay. What does this book, The Management of Police Specialized Tactical Units, say to the reader?
The management of police specialized tactical units is telling police departments and police personnel how to professionally run a special weapons and tactics team, and how to respond to special problems in a reasonable and lawful way.
Now, you also co-authored another book with Professor Majerus, and that is Significant Tactical Police Cases, Learning from Past Events to Improve Upon Future Responses. Is that right?
Yes.
And what does that book tell the reader?
That book tells the reader to be aware of the past so that you don't repeat those things in the past that shouldn't be repeated. It starts with David and Goliath, then moves on to ending with Christopher Dorner, who was a person that was in the news here a couple of years ago that was a mistake my department made in terms of hiring. And in any event, the subjects in the book, the chapters in the book, evolved from way back up to Christopher Dorner, and what we can learn from those incidents and apply them now so we're not making the same bad mistakes.
Now, one qualification I want to talk about, because it's relevant to this case, I understand that you're a master instructor for the use of less lethal equipment. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What does it mean to be considered a master instructor?
That I can train other instructors so that they can provide training with everything from OC spray, tear gas, chemical agents, handheld, those deployed with 37 or 40 millimeter deployment, also tasers, batons, all of the different less lethal choices. And so I train trainers to provide that training to their department.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to offer Ronald McCarthy as an expert in the area of police procedures, including the use of force.
Come aboard, Your Honor.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. McCarthy.
Good morning, ma'am.
You are not a psychologist, are you, Mr. McCarthy?
No, I'm not.
And have no training in psychology, is that right?
That's correct.
And you are not an expert in perception and reaction time, are you, sir?
I teach perception and reaction as part of the training and applying any of the uses of force that we apply. So yes, reactionary gaps.
Okay, and I'm asking about something
Yes.
different. You teach reactionary gaps as far as firearms are concerned, but you are not a scientist in perception or reaction time, are you, sir?
I am not a scientist in anything.
And you have done no research into that topic to try to determine what the perception or reaction time is, have you, sir? You've done no research?
I have read and tried to educate myself on that subject because it's very relevant to all police tactics, so you have to be aware of it. And I've been aware of it for many, many years.
Yes, sir. Did you hear my question, Mr. McCarthy, which is you haven't done any research in the area of perception and reaction time?
No, I just studied it.
And you don't have the equipment to precisely measure the time it takes to make a decision or to execute an action, do you, sir?
Would you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. You don't have the scientific equipment to precisely measure the time it takes to make a decision or to execute an action, do you, sir?
That's correct. I'm not a scientist.
And you're not an expert in the science of go or no-go signals, are you, sir?
I don't consider myself an expert in go or no-go signals.
Okay, and a no-go signal is what the time it takes to stop an action. Do you know that, sir? That a no-go signal is the time it takes to stop an action? You're not an expert in that, are you, sir?
No, I'm just aware of it.
Okay, and you have written no peer-reviewed articles on that topic? Have you on perception or reaction as far as go and no-go signals?
I've not written anything on that. No.
Okay, and you've relied on other experts for that type of information?
I rely on it, and I do talk about it and teach it in my classes, yes.
Yes, sir. Is one of the main experts you rely on for your information about go and no-go signals and perception and reaction time in shooting Bill Lewinsky from the Force Sciences Institute?
That would be one, yes.
All right. And are you aware that Mr. Lewinsky has caused some controversy recently about not being qualified to do those kinds of investigations?
I understand some people have an argument with Bill Lewinsky. I'm not one.
All right. Your Honor, at this time I would accept him as an expert in what he's been offered for, but object to him testifying as a psychologist or on perception or on the science of perception and reaction times or go or no-go signals.
I think you'll have to raise those objections if they arise.
Correct, Judge.
But he is certified as an expert in police procedure and use of force, and Mr. Robles, you may proceed.
I'd like to talk about the process that you took to reach the opinions that you have in this case. Would you please explain to the jury how you went about educating yourself on this case so that you could form opinions about different questions that are associated with this case?
I reviewed probably 2,500 to 3,000 pages of different material that had to do with this incident, the officers, their training, the investigation that was accomplished in the aftermath of this incident, the training records of the police officers who were involved, both Sandy and Perez.
Now, after having reviewed those particular documents and items of evidence, did you form certain opinions? Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'd like to go over those opinions in I guess, a chronological manner, and I'd like to have you focus initially upon the arrival of the open space officers and their first encounter with Mr. Boyd. And I'd like to ask you your opinion about the officer's focus on Mr. Boyd not showing his hands immediately. Would you please explain to the jury how a reasonably well-trained officer would what a reasonably well-trained officer would do in response to a suspect who doesn't immediately show his or her hands?
First of all, the officer takes the entire situation into consideration. Time, location, why am I there? Somebody called and requested that the police remove somebody from an open space. So they go there. Their background and experience, who is in an open space and camping in an open space. Lots of people have different reasons for doing different things. So now they're there and they make contact and when they make contact, they verbalize in a professional and reasonable way, and generally people respond back in a positive way. That usually is what happens. When they got there and contacted Mr. Boyd, Mr. Boyd presented himself in a manner in which his body position, his stance, his hands being in his pockets, their training and their experience. Pockets contain a variety of different things. It can be contraband, or it can be weapons, or it can be nothing that's a threat to anybody. But they're concerned with that. So they also were in a position of some vulnerability because they're in very rough terrain, and he has high ground, and they're looking up at him. And so when he presented himself in the manner he did, that would cause them, if they were well trained, to be concerned.
Why would a reasonably well-trained officer focus on hands instead of focusing on a suspect's face?
It's human nature to focus on people's face to try to read them, and I'm sure that the officers, in my experience, go back and forth from hands to face very quickly because you focus on hands for the most part. And as you're focusing on the hands, it's part of your training and your experience that that's what holds weapons, that's what can hurt you. So they well focus on hands, but they also try to read the body and the face.
Based on your training and experience, how often do individuals who are instructed to show their hands fail to show their hands?
That is something that happens very infrequently. I once asked a police agency to, when I was back east, Gaithersburg PD, to give me a number of people that they contact from over a course of a month, and over 200 stops, everybody showed their hands.
Okay. So what does it say when a suspect doesn't show their hands after being ordered or asked to do so?
It first of all indicates that the person could be a threat and may have a weapon in their possession, which is concealed by the pocket. It could be contraband also. You could have a pocket full of drugs. And
Objection, Your Honor, we will strike. That isn't relevant to this case.
I'm sorry.
So,
So in any event, there's a number of things it can mean, but the officer's first concern would be reading the face, the body language of the suspect, and the hands in the pocket, and refusal to remove. All of that would be taken into consideration.
what would a reasonably well-trained officer do upon seeing a suspect with a pocket knife in his or her pocket?
A reasonably trained officer would tell them to cooperate, keep their hands away from the knife, don't touch it. Under the circumstances that exist, whether it's this one or another one, it would depend on whether the officer would cause the suspect turn around, get down on the ground, get on your knees, or get face down. Depends on how severe the circumstances are.
In your opinion, would a reasonably well-trained officer, upon seeing a person with a knife in their pocket, perform a pat-down search?
Objection, leaving, Your Honor.
Please explain how a reasonably well-trained officer, or in what circumstances a reasonably well-trained officer should perform a pat-down search when encountering a suspect who has a knife in their pocket.
Okay, if he knows that there's a knife in the pocket,
Yes.
first of all, they'd say, keep your hands away from your pockets, don't put your hands in your pockets. And then he would say, turn around. If he's on a surface like this, flat floor, not out here in the foothills. And then he would either approach the subject he could tell, or she could tell the subject to put their hands behind their head, lace their fingers, so that they could have more control, depending upon how threatening the subject looked. And then once controlling the hands with the support hand, the officer would check the pockets to make sure that he could recover the knife.
What would a reasonably well-trained officer do upon seeing a suspect who had a knife in the pocket and the officer wanted to perform a pat-down if the suspect said, "Don't touch me"?
The officer should maintain his distance and, again, try to verbalize and tell the subject whatever is appropriate at the time. Look, you need to cooperate with me. Right now, you're breaking the law because you're failing to obey the lawful direction of an Albuquerque police officer. If you continue, you'll be arrested. Turn around. You could go through a litany of different verbal techniques depending upon the circumstance.
In your review of the encounter that Open Space Officer Hernandez and Open Space Officer McDaniel had with Mr. Boyd upon meeting him in the open space, do you have any opinions about how that encounter was conducted by those officers?
Yes.
And what is that?
They did the right thing. He presented them immediately with what you could assume was an assaultive behavior, resistant assaultive behavior. His body language, his tone of voice, his attitude, and then his refusal to cooperate with them. He had his hands in his pockets, he wouldn't take them out. That would immediately cause officers to be concerned and would cause me to present my defensive weapon, which is a pistol, in a low-ready fashion to let them know that he's being considered a deadly threat when he isn't cooperating.
In your opinion, why was it appropriate for Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez to draw their weapons and hold them at the high or low ready when Mr. Boyd refused to be patted down?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
In your opinion, why was it proper for Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez to draw their weapons at the low ready or the high-low ready when Mr. Boyd refused to show his hands and refused to be patted down?
When he is refusing that, he is a deadly threat. He's also up, and having gone to the location, he's in an elevated position. You can move down from that elevated position faster than they can move up. And it would be very difficult to try to move in that terrain. You're pretty much stuck with the rocks and the cactus and not able to move quickly when somebody is changing distance, and they can do that very rapidly. You can close 10 or 15 feet in less than a second. And he's up, so he would be able to, now it's still rough terrain, so that would slow him down, but he could go pretty fast compared to what they could do to move out of the way. So they're at a disadvantage. He's got this elevated position, and they've drawn their weapons, and they have every reason to be concerned about their safety.
What protection, if any, does an officer's body armor provide him or her in defending an edge weapons attack or a knife attack?
It can provide some protection against domestic edged weapons. What I mean by that is a kitchen knife. Usually kitchen knives are not high-grade steel, and so therefore soft body armor can stop some of that. Bench-made knives, different knives that are made for work, if you will, or for hunters, that steel will go through soft body armor. It will penetrate it every time.
What experience have you had in reviewing cases in which soft body armor failed to protect an officer from the type of knives that can penetrate that kind of body armor?
What experience do I
Yes.
have with that? I shot body armor and stabbed body armor hundreds of times to demonstrate it to police officers what body armor can and can't do. And I would first shoot it with multiple rounds. And then I would stab it with a kitchen knife, and then I would stab it with a folding knife, and demonstrate what it could and could not provide for them in terms of safety.
In your opinion, having reviewed the edge weapons with which Mr. Boyd was armed, how effective would soft body armor be in stopping the edge weapons which Mr. Boyd had from penetrating?
Based on the fact that they were folding work and outdoor knives, I would be sure in my mind that they would probably penetrate level 2 and level 3A body armor, soft body armor. They wouldn't penetrate hard body armor.
Now, we were talking about Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez and in addressing Mr. Boyd. You gave certain opinions about how they handled the situation. Now I'd like to ask you a different question. What difference does it make, if any, that Mr. Boyd is mentally ill, in given the opinions you've already given about your thoughts on Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez?
The fact that Mr. Boyd is mentally ill, emotionally disturbed, would create concern on the part of a well-trained officer if they recognized that that person was afflicted, because officers are trained and understand that those kinds of people attack people and attack police officers. That's not unusual at all. A good portion of the mass shootings we see are paranoid schizophrenics.
Now, with regard to the training that law enforcement officers receive, you would agree that they are trained that not all mentally ill people are dangerous, is that right?
Yes.
What is the training with regards to those mentally ill individuals who happen to be dangerous to themselves and to others?
Those people that are dangerous to officers or other citizens are very unpredictable, and officers need to approach them with an awful lot of caution.
What is it about the unpredictability of some mentally ill individuals that makes them dangerous? What is it about that simple fact, unpredictability?
It's that you can't, the officer or anybody working with them, it's very difficult to count on any predictable action or activity, because the person may seem to be very calm in the moment, and then something may alter that. I've seen the presence of a uniform show up at a situation, and the mere fact that that person in a different uniform showed up, the person reacted in a very bizarre way. So it's the unpredictability of the inability to predict what that person is going to do if they have these kinds of emotionally disturbed symptoms.
Now, turning your attention to the second wave of officers, the field officers who responded as backup officers for the open space officers. Did you have an opportunity to review the field officers' response to Mr. Boyd?
Yes, sir.
Now, did you come away with any opinions about the manner in which the field services officers negotiated with Mr. Boyd, and what success, if any, they were having?
Yes, I did.
And what are those opinions?
First of all, that they did utilize verbal strategies, and they did talk to him, Officer Monet or Manette, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. He is a CIT trained officer, meaning he has special training in terms of communicating with people who are emotionally disturbed. That's usually, and in his case it was, a 40-hour training program. Those training programs are valuable to officers, so is their experience, because they do gain experience over 8 or 10 years in talking to people, even without the training.
So let me ask you
he
about
was
that.
trained.
I apologize for interrupting.
I'm sorry.
What does, let's assume you have an officer who's not CIT trained. In dealing with individuals over the course of a career, what experience does an officer receive that helps them be able to communicate with individuals who are emotionally disturbed that doesn't come from CIT training?
As a uniformed police officer, you're constantly in contact with a variety of different people. You receive radio calls to a domestic dispute. The domestic dispute has led to some kind of physical confrontation. A woman has been physically abused by her husband or her boyfriend. She's in tears. She has some injuries. Trying to talk to her and get the facts from her. Doing it in a manner, because she's obviously upset, she's obviously been assaulted. So that is a sensitive moment. Children who have been physically
I'm going to
abused.
object, Your Honor. I'm going to object and ask that the witness not testify in the form of a narrative, but be provided questions, and I'm going to object to this particular area that he's going into now as well.
I'll say with regard to a narrative,
Okay.
and let me just ask for the next question, please.
Now, you were describing the sorts of incidents that help train and educate an officer in their everyday work experience that allow them to essentially become conversant and experienced in negotiating with emotionally disturbed people. You were talking about a particular example involving children, is that right?
Yes.
Now, how is it that an officer is in sort of work with children who may be abused in one way or another, helps them deal with and learn how to communicate with people who are emotionally disturbed?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Oh,
Okay.
The officer, within their personality and their own abilities, when talking to a victim, child, woman usually, in those circumstances, the officer is trying to find out what happened and trying to do so in a way that is providing some sensitivity with the victim that they're talking to. And the officer learns how to do that over time, again, within their own personality, their own ability.
So when you say within an officer's own personality and ability, what are you referring to?
Some officers aren't as capable initially because they can be pretty structured based on their past and their where they come from and their experience, and pretty rigid, and they don't realize the need for sensitivity. But a 6'2", 220-pound police officer can be intimidating to a victim. So that person has to learn how to present himself so that he doesn't appear to be somewhat off-putting. And so you develop that art. Some people have it from the very beginning, and they're really good at it from the very beginning. It's different for everybody.
Now, we were talking about the response of the field services officers, and we were talking about Officer Monette. That's how I believe he said his name. Officer Monette's communications with Mr. Boyd. In your opinion, how successful was Officer Monette in trying to convince Mr. Boyd to surrender?
He was not successful in convincing him to surrender, but he was successful.
In what way do you, or why do you say that Officer Monet was successful?
Because the Officer Manette was applying sensitive verbal techniques in regard to Mr. Boyd, and Mr. Boyd was rejecting him. So it stands on its face that, first of all, it's required that somebody do that, and he did do that, and then it was rejected by Mr. Boyd.
Now, when you say it was rejected from Mr. Boyd, what does that say about the nature of the negotiations and their success?
Well, at that time, the negotiations were successful in that we utilized them, but they failed to impress Mr. Boyd. So, good that we used it. I wish it would work, is where you are at that point in time.
Do you have an opinion with regard to the decision to have Officer Monette removed from the position of negotiating with Mr. Boyd?
Yes, I do.
What is that opinion?
If he's not gaining any ground with Mr. Boyd and everything is static and hasn't changed, then we need to try somebody else.
What about this notion that time is on your side, that you can wear down a suspect if you talk to him or her long enough? How does that play into your opinion?
Time is a fractious element. Time can be on your side if you utilize it. But then eventually time begins to work against you.
What do you mean by that?
The circumstances, not necessarily in this case, because people were in place for about 3 hours, but fatigue on the part of the people involved, and just negotiating with somebody for 2 or 3 hours because you're working so hard to try to say and do the right things can wear you out. It's like going through an oral interview for a job promotion. If you do that for 3 hours, you're going to be very tired. So the fatigue factor can play a role, and in different places and different positions. So that's always an issue.
What opinions, if any, do you have about the decision made by the field services sergeant to involve the New Mexico State Police in negotiating with Mr. Boyd?
That was very good on their part.
Why do you say that?
Because Mr. Boyd made a statement that he wanted to talk to, or indicated that he wanted to talk to the state police. So they accommodated that. If their attitude was, hey, let's try that, if it'll work, this is a good thing. And so they did accommodate and bring the state police to Mr. Boyd. And he rejected that and threatened Sergeant Ware of the state police.
Now, there came a point in time in which a canine officer, Scott Weimerskirch, began negotiating with Mr. Boyd. Did you review that material?
Yes, sir.
What opinions do you have about Officer Weimerskirch's efforts to negotiate with Mr. Boyd?
I thought he displayed professional skill at talking to somebody to try to talk them into cooperating.
What about the whole idea that Officer Weimerskirch was not CIT trained? What role, if any, did that play in forming your opinion regarding Officer Weimerskirch's success or failure in negotiating?
It didn't appear to have any effect here. Weimerskirch was using generally the same verbal techniques, and that was to be conversational, to try to get the individual without yelling at the individual. When we're talking to somebody who's emotionally disturbed, we don't yell at them. We don't threaten them with verbally telling them that we're going to use force, and I didn't see anywhere where that was done. And the strategy that he was using was consistent with Monet. So trying a different person is a reasonable alternative if somebody isn't getting any success.
Why is it appropriate in certain circumstances to move from one negotiator to another and then maybe a third?
Because everybody reacts differently to every single person they encounter. We all have different reactions to people. And it could be that if we try one person and after 40 or 50 minutes that's not working, that within 3 or 4 minutes somebody else will have success, and I've seen that. And I have a hard time explaining what was going on in that person's mind that all of a sudden they would cooperate, but as it turned out, they did. And in this case, it didn't work.
In your opinion, is that a reasonable choice among the many choices an officer has about allowing one officer to negotiate or allowing several officers to negotiate?
It's a reasonable choice. It's a decision, and there's no right and wrong in that decision if there is no progress being made. If there's no progress being made, it makes it reasonable to try somebody else.
Now, is it fair to say that there are no, in your opinion, what hard and fast rules, if any, are there in making a decision to go from one negotiator to another?
It's really, hard and fast rules are, first of all, hard and fast rules. We try to be conversational, we don't threaten. And that's just basic. And then we try to make some kind of a connection with the individual, a personal connection if we can. And you might mention family, but you have to be careful about that. You might inquire about family, but family may be that person's big issue and why they're acting this way. So we have to be very careful about what we say. And when we're talking to this individual, what we're trying to do is be conversational and try to get that person to calm down.
Now, in your review of the negotiations conducted by Officer Monette, State Police Officer Bankston, and Officer Scott Weimerskirch, what is your opinion as to whether those officers followed the hard and fast rules that you've identified?
I think that they operated consistently with the kind of training and strategy that you see nationwide.
Now I'd like to ask you about a different topic, and that is the state's contention that Mr. Boyd was surrendering. Have you had an opportunity to consider the state's contention that Mr. Boyd was surrendering?
Yes.
And do you have any opinions with regards to the state's contention that Mr. Boyd was surrendering?
Yes.
What is your opinion about the state's contention that Mr. Boyd was surrendering?
I don't agree with it at all.
Would you please explain why you do not agree with the state's contention that Mr. Boyd was surrendering?
Yes, sir. As the situation was unfolding and officers were closing, Mr. Boyd retrieved the knives from his pockets. The first indication that anybody is surrendering is they do not obtain weapons if they don't have weapons in their hand. And then if they do have weapons in their hand, they get rid of them right away. That's common sense from a police perspective. So first of all, as they were closing, he obtained the weapons.
When you mean he, you mean Mr. Boyd, is that correct?
Mr. Boyd. Someone might suggest, well, he obtained them so that he could drop them, but he didn't. He held on to them as they closed, and there was plenty of opportunity to get rid of the weapons. He did not.
With regard to the whole concept of surrender and its applicability to this case, what did you take away from the fact that when Officer Weimerskirch closed the distance between him and Mr. Boyd, that Mr. Boyd armed himself with knives?
My takeaway from that, in my opinion, simply is that when he saw Weimerskirch closing, he armed himself because he had an intent to violently resist with deadly weapons.
Excuse me, Mr. McCarthy. Now he's going into the area of psychology, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
He was arming himself with the intent to attack the officers who were closing on him. And he continued to hold on to the weapons.
In your opinion, what, if anything, should the officers have inferred from the fact that Mr. Boyd began to move as the shooting began to unfold?
Objection, Your Honor, leading and assumes facts not in evidence.
I don't think it's leading, nor does it assume anything. So let me state the question again.
Okay. With regard to the issue of surrender, what, if anything, should the officers infer from the fact that right before the shooting began to take place that Mr. Boyd moved?
The movement is coupled with the fact that he has taken the knives in hand, and his body language, everything is going to be encapsulated into what the officers are observing. Facial expressions probably, but I don't know that for sure. In any event, as they're closing, they would assume that he was going to attack them with knives. That was a natural assumption they're trained to assume.
I will have you assume, as a hypothetical, that Mr. Boyd was turning away from the officers. Let's assume that that's the facts. How does that change your opinion, if at all, with regards to the fact, that you do not believe Mr. Boyd was surrendering?
I'm sorry, what was the last word? Mr. Boyd was what?
That Mr. Boyd was surrendering.
Because surrender is dropping the weapons. When any suspect is surrendering, and people have said drop the weapons multiple times, and people have said get down on the ground, and they're saying it multiple times, get down. Those things take place right away when somebody is surrendering. When neither one of those things are taking place, it's obviously not a surrender. The movement is indicative of resistance.
Now, I'd like to have you assume that the state is contending that when Officer Perez told Mr. Boyd to get on the ground, that Mr. Boyd was getting on the ground. I'd like to have you assume that that's the state's contention. How would that contention affect your opinion that Mr. Boyd was not surrendering?
I saw nothing to indicate that he was surrendering, and getting on the ground can be done where he is. To get on the ground doesn't take any movement other than to get on the ground.
Now, you stood in the location where Mr. Boyd was standing, is that right?
Yes.
And you had an opportunity, of course, to review all the photographs in this case, is that right?
Yes.
And you were able to position yourself when you went up on that hill in the location where Mr. Boyd was standing.
Yes.
In your opinion, based on your physical inspection of that hilltop, what options did Mr. Boyd have in going to the ground in front of him?
He could have gone to the ground in front of him.
Would you please explain why you believe that?
It is an area that is rough. I certainly wouldn't want to try to sleep on it, but it is an area where you can get on the ground. It is a smooth little plateau area, smooth by comparison to the rest of the terrain around that, which is very difficult. There's no cactus where he was. There's cactus everywhere else, within 1.5 feet or 2 feet. Everywhere you look, there's a variety of different cactuses. And so where he was, no problem in getting on the ground. Absolutely none.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to a different topic, and that is the environment in which this incident occurred. Now, you lived in that area by the foothills, is that right?
Yes, sir.
You worked in an area of the Manzanos that was the foothills of the Manzanos?
Yes.
And you went up and inspected this area at about the same time that, or I should say, at this, when the lighting level was the same as it was in March of 2014, is that right?
That's correct.
Now I'd like to talk to you about how the environment affected the officer's ability to respond to the incident involving Mr. Boyd. Now, how does terrain play a factor in the officer's decisions that were made on this night in which Mr. Boyd was shot?
Well, the terrain itself, once it gets dark out there, it's dark. It's virtually impossible to see much because there's no ambient light from any place. The houses are about 200 yards away, so the ambient light, normal ambient light from a residence wouldn't be of any value at that point in the area where they were. So the rough terrain, he's up, they're down. That is significant because it's very difficult to go up there, and it would be easier for him to come down if he was intent on doing so. The entire situation with the darkness beginning, it's dusk, and then there's a ton of people there. I had no idea how many people there. I can't say exactly how many people were there in the area on that particular day, but when I was there, I know there were several joggers, there were several people on dirt bikes on the path. There were people walking their dogs on the path, all three of those and multiple of those. And
so
and
what role does citizen, I guess, use of this area play in the officer's decisions about this case?
that Mr. Boyd, being a threat to the police officer is one thing. Is he a threat to the citizens? They have to assume that he is, because he's acting irrational and he's got deadly weapons and he won't cooperate. So their first responsibility, as I said earlier, is to those citizens that are in the area, and they were all over the place out there. They're not just on the trail. They're also on the hill. And then I saw a video that showed people, apparently young people, who were in that general area when they were dealing with Mr. Boyd.
In your opinion, would it have been wise to allow Mr. Boyd to simply walk down the hill?
He could easily have done that.
No, would it have been wise for the police to allow Mr. Boyd to simply walk down the hill with his knives?
Chairman, I think he was answering the question, and then there was a leading question.
In your opinion, would you please explain whether it would have been wise for the police officers to allow Mr. Boyd to simply walk down the hill armed with his knives?
Not armed with his knives, no.
Why is that?
Because he has already exhibited verbally, physically, his intention to attack people and attack police with the knives. So he's done that over and over again. So therefore, a well-trained officer would definitely not want to have him come down with the weapons, because the officer doesn't want to shoot anybody. And if he's coming down with the weapons, that would increase the potential of him, the officer, having to use deadly force when it wouldn't have been necessary if the knives were left on the ground on the plateau.
In your opinion, what concerns would a reasonably well-trained police officer have if, for example, the officers tried to create a mobile perimeter around Mr. Boyd as he walked down the hill armed with knives?
Objection, again, I think the answers, for example, on creating a mobile perimeter without are leading the witness.
I'm going to take a recess for the jury for 10 minutes. We've been here for over an hour. Recess.